Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the very first episode of the Muslim Bitcoiner podcast. My name is Abdullah and I'll be the host for this series. For right now, I'm hoping to stay fairly anonymous, although that will probably change depending on the success and the demand of this podcast. So, I haven't been in the Bitcoin space for too long. I've only been really going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole for about 2.5 to 3 years. But I did first hear about Bitcoin in 2014 when my older brother first told me about it. And, like most people that are hear about Bitcoin first, they kind of immediately dismiss it. And then in 2019, my brother sent me the legendary book, The Bitcoin Standard. And this is what got me going down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I never thought about things like the history of money, economics, where money comes from, or concept concept like time preference. So it was really illuminating for me, and it really got me motivated to like research more, not just about Bitcoin, but about money in general. So I've watched some videos and read some articles, and I've read The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, Layered Money, The Price of Tomorrow, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and I've also read some Austrian economics textbooks as well. So needless to say, my older brother was really instrumental in my orange pilling journey, and he was very excited to orange pill me, and he urged me to get a Twitter account to follow some Twitter plebs and some of the famous Bitcoiners in the space. So I chose the name Muslim Bitcoiner because those are kind of the two things that I'm really passionate about. And alhamdulillah, when I joined Twitter, I found a small but vocal community of Muslim Bitcoiners. I mean, sure, this community is kind of small, but I can see that they're very passionate. And inshallah, I hope to grow this community. I kind of want to be a part of that. And inshallah, that was kind of the main motivation for me to start this podcast. Is I kind of want to give another medium for Muslims to talk about Bitcoin, especially from a Bitcoin only perspective. Um, I notice that a lot of Muslims that are, into Bitcoin tend to also be into cryptocurrency in general. And I notice that a lot of Islamic finance podcasts and YouTube videos will, talk about cryptocurrency in general, but don't actually talk about Bitcoin from a Bitcoin only perspective. So, there's not that much activity going on, I think, with talking about the intersection between Islam and Bitcoin. Of course, there are some media out there that talks, there's articles and videos and podcast interviews that talk about the intersection between Islam and Bitcoin. One of my favorite ones is the interview between Harris Irfan and Saifuddin that talk about Bitcoin being the most Islamic form of money. I highly recommend you go listen to that because that's kind of what got me started into thinking Bitcoin, not just being halal, but also being the most Islamic form of money. But I feel like even, with podcasts like that, podcast episode like that, I feel like there's more to discuss. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to achieve in this podcast, inshallah. I also want to give a shout out to Muawiyah Tucker, who goes by the name Crypto Hash Review on Twitter and YouTube. He's the only Islamic scholar I see that's actively talking about Bitcoin actually promoting the adoption of Bitcoin for Muslims. And I think he's the only Islamic scholar that actually like groks Bitcoin, and it's not just talking about whether it's halal or haram, but actually advocating for Muslims to adopt a Bitcoin as a way to escape riba. So again, like I've said, this podcast is going to be Bitcoin only, and we're not going to be shilling any shit coins or talking about blockchain and metaverse. This is not the podcast for that. Like I said, we'll explore the intersection between Islam and Bitcoin, and we're not just going to focus on whether Bitcoin is halal or haram. We're actually going to be making the Muslim case for Bitcoin as well. We'll also spend a lot of time talking about fiat and riba. For my non-Muslim viewers, riba encompasses it talks about a lot, but for riba, when I talk about it, I'm usually referring to interest or usury, and I strongly believe that in order to understand Bitcoin, especially if you're Muslim, you have to understand what fiat is, and you have to understand what riba is, and you also have to understand the problems that we have in fiat and how riba is entrenched within the fiat system. So we'll be talking a lot about that on this podcast. We'll also be talking about some concepts, inshallah, in Islamic finance and Islamic banking. We'll also be talking about Islamic economics and also Austrian economics as well. We'll also be talking about the history of money, as well as like the properties and characteristics of money as well, because I think that subject is really important in understanding both fiat and Bitcoin. So, like I've said before, I think there's a huge need for a Bitcoin only space for Muslims. As like I've said, there's a lot of Islamic finance podcasts that kind of, will say that they're going to be talking about Bitcoin, but then they just end up bringing up all of these irrelevant topics about blockchain and Web3 and metaverse. Actually, there was recently a interview with, um, Man Ali Khan, and there were some others on that interview as well. And I was kind of excited to listen to it because they were going to be talking about Bitcoin. But that whole interview, there was only a small section that was talking about Bitcoin, and they immediately started talking about other cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology and metaverse and all of this other crap. And it was just a lot of noise, and they didn't even bother talking about like fiat or riba or how Bitcoin addresses those problems specifically. So, I kind of want to use this podcast series to, talk about Bitcoin only, and I will make it a point to regularly rip on other coins. So, if you're into blockchain technology or other altcoins, this podcast is not for you. So let me just go over some of the themes that we'll talk about on this podcast, inshallah. So first of all, like I've said before, I think fiat is a really important subject for Muslims to understand, specifically the role of riba in the fiat system. A lot of Muslims believe that you can separate the riba from fiat, although you can't really do that. You can kind of like obfuscate it or cover it with a bunch of transactions to make it look like you've separated the riba from fiat, but to me it's an impossible task because riba is actually what's needed for fiat, so it's not something that you can separate. I think this is something that more Muslims need to be talking about because, riba is one of the most heinous sins in Islam. It's one of the gravest sins you can commit is being engaged in riba. So, like, we need to actually talk about it and explore it. And once we explore it, we need to figure out a way to escape it. And I argue that Bitcoin is our best escape from fiat, and I believe that Bitcoin is anti-riba money. Um, what I mean by Bitcoin being anti-Riba money is that there are properties that Bitcoin has that make it the perfect way to fight against Riba. The only reason why we have so much Riba in our current monetary system is through fiat. Riba is the engine that makes fiat work, but when you introduce something like Bitcoin, like a hard money like Bitcoin, it actually fights against that riba. And we'll be talking about how Bitcoin specifically is anti-riba on this podcast, and that will be a regular theme that we'll bring up, inshallah. I also want to address the weakness of gold because a lot of Muslims think that, okay, well, if we have this problem with fiat and riba, all we need to do is go back to a gold standard. But there are problems with gold that we all know, and that how do you transfer gold over large distances? How do you safely store large amounts of gold through time? And how do you process small payments in gold? The problem with gold is that you always need a third party to be able to kind of like facilitate it. And when you have a third party that's kind of facilitating the gold transactions and gold storage, that third party can issue claims and credit against that gold. And when you have a third party issuing credit against that gold, there's always going to be riba involved in it because any business that's in the business of issuing debt is inherently going to have riba in that. And actually, this is how we got into our current fiat system is through the weakness of gold. We'll be talking more about that on this podcast, and I think it's a really important point for Muslims to understand that yes, we did have a gold standard before, but the reason why we don't have a gold standard is not because like people are evil and they just want to um, find a way to spread riba. I mean, gold was a way to keep that in check, but ultimately, because of gold's weakness, you'll always end up having a fiat system based on riba. And just because you go back to a gold standard today doesn't mean that it's going to be different this time. You'll end up with the same result every time. So, like I've said, this is a Bitcoin only space, and we'll never, you don't have to worry about me shilling an altcoin on this space. This will be a regular we'll make it a regular theme uh, to rip on other altcoins and focus specifically on Bitcoin. And we're not going to be promoting some halal altcoin or anything like that. Ultimately, all these altcoins are just fiat financial instruments that seek to drag you back into fiat and riba. So, I'm not here to say that shit coins are haram, but this ultimately these shit coins are noise, and Bitcoin is the signal. Another topic I want to address is what I call fiat fatwas. So there's been a lot of rulings that have been issued by scholars saying that Bitcoin is haram, and when you listen to their rulings, they use the most stupid reasons about why Bitcoin is haram. They'll say something like, "Oh, Bitcoin is speculative," and not realizing that if their problem is with speculation, then their problem isn't with Bitcoin. You can speculate on potatoes, but that doesn't make potatoes haram. It makes the act of speculation haram. So we'll also be talking about these fiat fatwas and where scholars will deem Bitcoin haram, or sometimes if they do deem Bitcoin halal, they don't really talk about the Bitcoin having anti-Riba properties. They'll just say, oh, Bitcoin is halal, and they'll just go on to talk about other cryptocurrencies that are halal or haram, completely missing the point and innovation that Bitcoin has. I want to give another shout out to Muawiyah Tucker on his YouTube page on Crypto Hash Review. He has a series of videos where he debunks every claim made by every scholar against Bitcoin, and I think that series is just amazing, and I highly recommend you check it out. It's kind of sad that a lot of these scholars will discover Bitcoin and they'll just kind of lump it in with cryptocurrencies, and of course there will be some shitcoin that pumps and gets rug pulled, and then they'll say, see, look, cryptocurrency is a scam, you should not be investing in Bitcoin. But they completely do not see that Bitcoin is its own is its own money that's completely separate from cryptocurrency and all of these shitcoin scams. So we'll be addressing those arguments made by these scholars as well on this podcast, inshallah. Another topic we'll address is Islamic banking. So this is something that I'm not very well versed in Islamic finance and Islamic banking, but I'm still learning about it, and I'm reading more books about it. But I want to say that I do notice two things about the Islamic finance space is that specifically in Islamic banking, is that to me it just seems like all Islamic banking tries to do is that they just try to mimic whatever the current fiat system does with its financial instruments that are just based on debt, and then they'll just replicate it, and then they'll just somehow try to take out the riba from it. But like I've said before, you can't take out the riba from fiat. So they'll just try to obfuscate the riba within the within the transaction within an Islamic bank, and they'll just deem it halal, and then Muslims don't bother thinking that much more about it, and they'll just say, oh, we've already fixed fiat, we have Islamic banking. So I want to be able to address that point that Islamic banking doesn't solve riba. Is that riba is still involved even in Islamic banking, not because these Islamic bankers are malicious or anything. That's just because that's the nature of fiat. You cannot escape the riba that's within fiat, and Islamic banking won't help you do that. And like I've said before, a lot of Muslims that are in the Islamic finance space will regularly promote shitcoins, and they won't even comment about Bitcoin's anti-riba properties. So that's why I think there really needs to be Bitcoin only education within for Muslims, and that's kind of what I'm hoping that this podcast will do, is that it will address Bitcoin being anti-riba. So I would love to interview people on this podcast from within the Islamic banking or Islamic finance space to get their perspective on what they think about Islamic banking in general, but also what they think about Bitcoin, and do they think about Bitcoin as being anti-riba money? And I think it would be really cool to kind of get perspectives from people in Islamic banking and Islamic finance as well. So I guess that I'm just going to go ahead and conclude here. But before I do that, I just want to say that I'm very excited to start this series, and inshallah, I'm hoping some good will come of it. If you have any suggestions or comments, please feel free to message me on Twitter. My DMs are open. And please let me know if there's anything I can add or address, or if there's anything that needs to be corrected in anything that I've said, inshallah. There's so much knowledge and many topics to explore between Islam and Bitcoin, and I don't think I know that I won't be able to do it on my own. So it would be cool to kind of get perspectives and help from people that are listening to this. And the thing that I want to drive home is that I'm not just promoting Bitcoin as halal money. I'm promoting it as the most Islamic form of money, and I'm promoting it as our only way of escaping riba within the current fiat system. That's kind of that's what I'll be regularly promoting on this podcast, inshallah. And I hope to interview some Muslims on this Bitcoin space, especially some of the big Muslim Bitcoiners on Twitter, and be able to get their perspectives on Muslim Bitcoin adoption, or just how they got into Bitcoin and what they think of Bitcoin being anti-Riba money, or what are some of the obstacles for Muslims adopting a Bitcoin standard. And like I said before, that there's a small active community within Twitter where you have Muslims that are into Bitcoin and that kind of get that Bitcoin is anti-riba money, and I'm so excited to be a part of that movement and a part of that group, inshallah. And I hope to interview some of you all on this podcast, inshallah. All right, that's all I have for my introductory episode. All right, until next time, assalamu alaikum.